October 3rd, 9:17 a.m., Savannah Bay, Georgia. My card beeped and turned red. The terminal flashed a message that seemed to drain the warmth from my hands. Account frozen, court order. Case hashtag 48-923. Ridgway, Eleanor. A court order. On my own accounts. I stood there in the grocery store aisle with a basket that held nothing extravagant, just milk, bread, and a box of Earl Grey. The cashier, a soft-spoken young man who recognized me from my weekly visits, looked toward the front counter. A courier had slipped in moments earlier and left a white envelope with my name printed in heavy block letters. He set it gently beside the reader. Summons, Dylan Ridgway versus Eleanor Ridgway. Claim, $350,000. Witness, Sierra Blake. My son had sued me. Over a wedding. For a moment it felt as though the hum of the refrigerators went silent. How could they do this to me? If this moment stirs something familiar in you, stay with me. What comes next is the truth I carried in silence for far too long. My name is Eleanor Ridgway, and at 74, I have learned that a life can be full and steady and still take on fractures you never expected. I spent most of my years in Savannah Bay, tending a small farm supply store that my late husband, Mark, and I built out of an old grain shed. We stocked seed, gloves, and tools, and we kept a coffee pot running in the corner because folks liked to linger and talk. After Mark passed in 1998, I ran it alone. The work kept me upright, sweeping aisles, sorting invoices, remembering the exact brands every farmer preferred. Some evenings I would lock up, place my keys on the counter, and feel a small pulse of pride. I had done it without breaking. I raised 3 children in that world of steady labor and sun-bleached calendars. Laura, Caleb, and Dylan. I taught them to ride bikes in the cracked driveway behind the store. I packed lunches at 5 in the morning so I could open on time. I made Halloween costumes out of felt and thread, even when my fingers were stiff from stacking feed bags all day. I paid for their braces, their sports fees, their college books, and later, when life grew harder for them, their emergencies, rents, medical bills, deposits, a car repair in winter that saved Caleb's job. I rarely said no. It wasn't martyrdom. It was simply how I understood motherhood. A quiet, continuous giving. Laura, the eldest, became an attorney in New York. Sharp, controlled, and unafraid to speak truth, even when it stung. She visits when she can, always with a leather binder tucked under her arm, as if ready to review the world's contracts. She and I are alike in ways that used to cause friction, though now I see the resemblance with gentler eyes. Caleb is the middle child, soft-spoken, careful, the kind of man who notices when the porch steps need repair, or when the family dog's bowl is nearly empty. He has always been the subtle glue between us all, though he never sees himself that way. He works at a marine workshop, restoring old wooden boats after storms. He has a patience that I never quite mastered. And then there is Dylan, my youngest. Charming, bright, and restless. He came into the world wanting more attention, more approval, more room to stretch. Even as a boy he had an appetite for being the center of something. He loved grand gestures and expensive dreams, and I tried in my way to meet him halfway. I told myself it was simply his nature, that he would grow out of it once he found purpose. For years I believed that. But slowly, almost invisibly, his wants began to take the shape of expectations. If I filled his tank with gas once, he assumed I would do it again. If I covered one overdue bill, he treated it as routine. The line between help and obligation blurred until I no longer knew where my generosity ended and his entitlement began. When Sierra appeared in his life, a pretty, polished young woman with ambitions that gleamed like the rings on her fingers, I tried to welcome her. She smiled often, though never at anything I said. I would find her glancing around my living room the way a realtor surveys a property, assessing value, calculating potential. At first I brushed it off as nerves or youth or simply the difference between generations. But something in her eyes stayed cold, even when her voice was sweet. Over time, patterns formed that I tried not to see. Dylan called only when he needed something. A loan for flights, a contribution for rent, coverage for a credit card payment he forgot was due. Sierra's visits took on the air of evaluation, as if she were mentally appraising every object in my home. And when I once overheard her say, in a tone meant to sound harmless, "Her house is the only real investment he has," I felt a small tear open somewhere inside me. Still, I kept telling myself families go through phases. I told myself Dylan was under pressure, that Sierra was ambitious, that young people sometimes speak carelessly. I told myself not to take every slight to heart. A mother can survive many small cuts without realizing she is bleeding. But the truth was quieter and harder. Somewhere along the way they had stopped seeing me as a person with limits, needs or rights. I had become something else, an account, a resource, a safety net that required no gratitude. And though I didn't admit it at the time, a part of me sensed that something darker was taking shape. A shift in the air, subtle as a change in the tides, but certain. Looking back, it's clear that this was the beginning of the unraveling. Not the dramatic blow, the lawsuit would come later, but the quiet erosion of how they saw me and, more painfully, how I saw myself. I had built my life on giving. They had begun to treat that giving as a guarantee. And guarantees once assumed become demands. I remember the moment with a clarity that feels almost unfair, because at the time it slipped past me like something too small to matter. It was 2 years ago, a late autumn afternoon, when the air around Savannah Bay carried that faint coolness that settles on the skin like a reminder of the coming winter. I was at the kitchen table, sorting a small mountain of receipts that had collected in my purse. My reading glasses kept sliding down my nose, and the paper crinkled under my palms in that familiar way, thin, fragile, almost whispering. Dylan walked in without knocking, as he often did then. He stood in the doorway, leaning his shoulder against the frame, his phone still glowing in his hand. There was a brightness about him, that restless, hungry spark he had carried since childhood, as if he were always leaning toward some new horizon. He didn't smile, not really, but his mouth made a small effort, the kind that looks more like preparation than warmth. "Mom," he said, his voice casual in a way that didn't match his eyes. "You always told me you wanted to give me a big start in life." For a moment I simply blinked at him, unsure what he meant. I laughed lightly, not mockingly, just in that gentle way mothers do when they think a child is being dramatic. "Support, sweetheart." "I meant support, not money," I said, brushing my thumb over the corner of a receipt to flatten it. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, not even fully. Just a tightening around the eyes, a faint closing off. It was the kind of look someone gives when they've already imagined a different answer, rehearsed it even, and now must conceal disappointment. He turned his head slightly, as though noticing something outside the window, though his eyes weren't really looking. The light caught his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the flicker of something I couldn't name. He said nothing more. He only nodded once, clipped and quiet, and walked out toward the porch. The screen door closed with a soft, restrained thud. I waited for the sound of his car engine, but it didn't come for a long moment. When it finally did, it felt strangely abrupt, as if he had been sitting there collecting himself. I returned to my receipts, though I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the tone of his voice, the way he lingered in the doorway, the strange seriousness of that one sentence. A discomfort tugged at me, small, quick, like a thread snagging on a nail. I told myself not to be foolish. Children grow older, dreams shift, expectations expand. Maybe he was only venting, or imagining a future that felt heavy. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, let the steam warm my face, and opened the window to let in the marsh air. For a little while the feeling drifted away, but it returned, quietly, gradually. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the subtle lines forming between us, like hairline fractures in old porcelain. Dylan called more often, but every conversation circled the same themes: new plans, new opportunities, new beginnings that somehow required a little push. When I tried to steer the talk toward his work or his well-being, he would pivot back to costs, chances, investments in his future stability. He spoke as if I were part of a financial strategy rather than a mother. One evening, I found him in the hallway, standing before the framed photograph of Mark and me on the opening day of our store. His fingertips hovered over the glass. The picture had always been a symbol of labor and love, something sturdy that had shaped our lives. Dylan looked at it differently, curiously, thoughtfully, almost appraisingly. "This place must be worth something now," he murmured. "It's worth the memories," I said gently. "The rest is just wood and walls." He smiled then, but it was thin. Maybe more than that. I should have asked what he meant. I should have leaned closer, should have let the question sit heavy between us until he answered it. But I didn't. I brushed the moment aside, telling myself he was just thinking about heritage or pride, or the simple nostalgia that sometimes touches grown children when they revisit their childhood home. As the months passed, the cracks widened. Dylan began asking questions that felt like small probes. How much I kept in savings, whether the store still earned enough, whether I had considered updating my will. He spoke lightly, almost jokingly, but the way he watched my face while waiting for my reaction left a faint chill in me. Sierra's presence added another layer. When she visited, she walked through my home slowly, her gaze lingering on my furniture, the old cedar chest, the china cabinet that had belonged to my mother. She had an evaluating eye, sharp and quiet. Once, when she thought I was out of earshot, I heard her whisper to Dylan, "This place really is her biggest asset." Her tone wasn't admiring. It was calculating. I told myself not to judge her too harshly. Young people today carry different pressures, different ideas about stability and future planning. Still, the air shifted when she was near. Something cold, something expectant. The moment that should have warned me came during a Sunday dinner. We had just finished eating when Dylan began talking about a colleague whose parents had set him up for life, with property and investments. He looked at me with a half-smile, almost playful, but his words cut close. "Some parents really know how to give their kids a strong start," he said. I felt Caleb glance at me. Laura raised an eyebrow. I swallowed a quiet ache, but I let it pass. I told myself he didn't mean anything by it. I told myself I was imagining the tension. I told myself so many things. Looking back now, those moments were warnings, soft, subtle, patient. They whispered, but I wasn't ready to hear them. I believed love could steady anyone. I believed Dylan would find his footing without demanding mine. But that was the first crack, the one I ignored. In the months after that first uneasy shift, life settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside but felt altered in all the quiet spaces. I still woke at 6, still made my tea in the blue-striped mug Mark bought me, still checked the windows to let in the marsh air. Yet a thin layer of tension had settled over everything, a sense that my home was no longer just lived in but quietly assessed, as if someone had begun appraising the corners of my life. Dylan's calls became more frequent, though never for companionship. He would begin warmly enough, asking about my day, but within a minute the true purpose of the call emerged. A missed bill, an unexpected fee, a temporary shortage he just needed help with. Each request was framed as small, harmless, reasonable. "Just this once," he'd say, although I'd lost count of how many once moments there had already been. His tone carried a practiced sincerity, something almost polished, as if he had prepared his lines in advance. Sierra's presence made everything sharper. When she visited, she moved through the rooms with a careful slowness, her gaze lingering on objects the way a jeweler studies stones. She complimented things in a tone that felt more like valuation. "This cabinet must be antique. This property must be worth quite a bit now." She smiled as she spoke, but her eyes remained cool, measuring. Once, I caught her standing before my grandmother's cedar chest, tracing the brass hinges with a thoughtful look. She didn't notice me. "This alone could cover part of it," she whispered, though I didn't know part of what. Dylan grew bolder in the way he spoke about futures, his future built from foundations he expected me to provide. At dinner one night he said, "Some parents help give their kids momentum. It's normal." His voice was light, but the weight beneath it pressed against me. Caleb glanced at me with quiet worry, and Laura's jaw tightened, but I simply nodded and changed the subject, unwilling to ignite conflict at the table. There were small moments too easy to dismiss individually, harder to ignore in accumulation. Dylan sighing when I mentioned needing to budget for repairs. Sierra exchanging a fleeting look with him when I said I preferred modest vacations. Their reactions carried an unspoken message. My priorities no longer aligned with theirs. My caution, once seen as responsible, was now treated as an obstacle. One afternoon, as I folded laundry, I overheard Sierra's voice through the guest room door. "Everything he wants depends on her," she murmured. "She has to step up." Dylan murmured something back, his tone a mix of frustration and quiet entitlement. The words settled in my chest like cold water. I stood there holding a towel against my heart, listening to the soft hum of the house, trying to steady myself. Their visits became shorter but heavier. Dylan began commenting on the state of the house, the aging couch, the worn porch rail, The old-fashioned ledger I still use for the store's remaining business. You could modernize, he said. You could make better use of what you have. His eyes lingered on the framed photograph of Mark and me opening the store years ago. Sierra nodded gently behind him, her smile neat and smooth. Another day, Dylan asked for help with a large deposit for a venue he and Sierra were considering. When I hesitated, he leaned back, studying me with an expression that felt foreign on his familiar face. You've worked hard your whole life. Maybe it's time that work pays off for your family. His voice was calm, almost persuasive, but the implication hollowed something inside me. I told him gently that I couldn't take on more. His face shuddered. Sierra's lips pressed into a thin line, and they left soon after. After the door closed behind them, the house fell into a silence that felt heavier than before. The late afternoon light stretched long across the floorboards, and I found myself standing beside the cedar chest, resting my hand against its smooth surface. I realized then that I had begun bracing myself each time I heard Dylan's voice. The ease between us, the natural closeness I once felt, had thinned into something strained. Their messages changed too. Sierra's texts became clipped, shaped like business inquiries rather than family notes. Dylan's requests carried urgency but less warmth. It was as if they had decided that my life, my work, and my home were pieces in a plan they had already drafted. I told myself then that families move through difficult seasons. I reminded myself of Dylan as a little boy chasing fireflies in the yard, his laughter rising like small bursts of light. I tried to believe he was still that child somewhere beneath the want and the worry. I held on to hope the way someone holds the fading edge of a blanket, thin in places, worn in others but familiar. Yet even in those days beneath the routines I felt a shift, a quiet pulling away. A sense that the ground beneath us was being slowly rearranged. And tension, once stretched long enough, always reaches its breaking point. The day the rail break arrived was warm, the kind of heat that settles low over Savannah Bay and makes the porch boards creak. I had just finished watering the potted herbs when I saw Dylan's car pull into the driveway. Sierra stepped out first, dressed sharply, every movement precise. Dylan followed, his smile wide but stiff, the kind he used when he wanted something and hoped charm might soften the ask. They walked toward me with an energy that felt rehearsed. I waited on the porch, sensing a heaviness in the air. "Mom," Dylan began brightly, "we have big news. The wedding plans are final. Disneyland Resort, peak season, the best of everything." His excitement sounded practiced, as though he were reading lines from a brochure. "That sounds lovely," I said. "I hope it's within your means." Sierra stepped forward, her voice smooth as glass. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Families invest in the future. We thought you'd want to be part of it in a meaningful way." "Meaningful how?" I asked. Dylan opened a folder and placed a paper on the table. "The total cost is $350,000. You can take a small mortgage on the house. It's simple. Nothing for you." The word struck like a blow. "Absolutely not," I said. His expression shifted, something sharp surfacing. Sierra's voice grew colder. "Your house is an asset, Eleanor. And this is your son's future." Then Dylan pulled out another document and tossed it onto the table. "You already promised. Family Agreement 2008. The signature looked like mine, but it wasn't. The date, the handwriting, the phrasing, none of it belonged to me. "This is fake," I whispered. "You just forgot," Dylan snapped. "You forget things all the time." Sierra crossed her arms. "We have a witness statement. If you back out, it's on you." For a moment, all I heard was the distant call of gulls. The porch swayed beneath me. They had planned this. They had prepared documents. They had expected me to sign away my security without question. "You need to leave," I said quietly. They walked back to the car without another word. Dylan didn't look back. The house was silent when I stepped inside, cool air brushing my skin. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling the betrayal settle in my chest like a stone. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was intent. A line had been crossed. I sat at the table, staring at the forged signature. A faint tremor passed through me. Not fear but awareness. Every small dismissal, every pointed comment, every evaluating glance from Sierra assembled into a truth I could no longer refuse. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the frames, the furniture worn smooth from years. This was my life, built piece by piece, never meant to be used as leverage. At the counter, I poured a glass of water and watched the ripples calm. My breath steadied with them. Betrayal sharpens everything. The fog I had allowed around Dylan's intentions finally cleared. He had crossed a boundary I never imagined he would. Something fundamental had shifted. As the evening dimmed, I closed the blinds one by one. A line had been drawn. Though the hurt moved through me like a tide, a current beneath it steadied. I could not remain passive. I could not let their plan define the course ahead. Something ended on that porch. But something stronger began to rise. That night, after Dylan and Sierra left the porch in silence, the house felt hollow in a way I had never experienced. The air carried a stillness that pressed against my ribs, as though the walls themselves needed time to absorb what had happened. I set the forged document on the kitchen table and stood over it, the overhead light flickering softly across the ink. My name, stolen, bent, misused, seemed to stare back at me. I sat down slowly, letting the chair creak beneath me. The hum of the refrigerator, normally a quiet comfort, now sounded distant and mechanical. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper and felt the faint, sharp sting of recognition. This wasn't confusion or desperation. This was calculation. I thought of the years I had spent supporting Dylan, helping with bills, guiding him through setbacks, believing that love could soften whatever restlessness kept him wandering. I remembered the firefly evenings, the school mornings, the way he once clung to my hand when storms rattled the windows. Those memories rose like fragile bubbles, only to burst under the weight of the present. A truth I had resisted finally settled into place. He no longer saw me as a mother, but as a means. My breath steadied as the realization grew clearer. There were signs I had ignored. Questions about my accounts, Sierra's appraising eyes, Dylan's sudden interest in the value of the house. Each moment had been a thread, and now they wove together into a pattern so stark, I could no longer look away. I rose from the table and walked through the quiet rooms. My hand drifted across the framed photographs lining the hallway. Mark's steady smile, Caleb's shy grin, Laura's determined gaze, and Dylan, bright-eyed, hopeful, untouched by the weight of expectations he would later place on me. I paused before each image, letting the past steady me. In my bedroom, I opened the closet and pulled out my small black suitcase, the one I used for short trips to visit Laura. I set it on the bed. The zipper felt cool beneath my fingers. I didn't know exactly what I would pack or where I would go, but the motion itself mattered. It was the first step toward reclaiming my life from the grip Dylan had tried to tighten around it. The house remained silent, but the silence no longer frightened me. Clarified things. I returned to the kitchen and looked again at the forged document. I picked it up carefully and placed it inside a folder along with old letters, bank statements, and the small receipts I had kept over the years from the times Dylan had borrowed money, just until payday. The evidence was scattered, but together it formed a record of a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. I made tea, the familiar scent of chamomile rising like a quiet reassurance. As I held the warm mug, I felt a calm resolve settle into my bones. This wasn't just about the lawsuit Dylan threatened or the debt he wanted me to shoulder. It was about the line between love and misuse. And I needed to protect that line before it vanished entirely. I carried my mug to the porch and stepped outside. The night air was thick with the scent of the bay, a mix of salt and mud that had always grounded me. The moon hung low, casting a pale shimmer on the wooden planks. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and let the breeze cool the warmth still burning in my chest. Sitting there, I felt the hurt wash over me again. But this time it didn't crush me. It clarified. Betrayal strips everything to its truth. I had spent years believing patience and generosity could steady Dylan. But love without boundaries becomes a doorway for harm. I had left that doorway open too long. I thought of Caleb, who never asked for more than I could give. Of Laura, sharp but loyal. I wondered how much they had seen. I knew I would need them, not for rescue but for clarity. The marsh rustled softly as the wind shifted. I closed my eyes and let the sound settle my breath. The world beyond my porch felt steady again, untouched by the turmoil Dylan had stirred. Somewhere in that stillness, courage took shape. When I finally rose to go inside, I felt steadier. The truth had arrived. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Laura arrived the next afternoon on the earliest flight she could find. I heard her suitcase wheels on the walkway before I saw her. Steady, purposeful, familiar. When I opened the door, she didn't speak. She simply stepped inside and wrapped her arms around me. The kind of embrace that doesn't ask questions, only answers them. We moved to the kitchen table where the forged document still lay in its folder. Laura pulled out her reading glasses and scanned each line with the calm precision I had always admired in her. When she looked up, her expression was controlled but unmistakably fierce. "Mom," she said quietly, "this isn't just forgery. It's coercion. And we're not letting it stand." Caleb arrived an hour later, his shirt still speckled with sawdust from the workshop. He stood behind my chair, resting a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I heard," he murmured. "I'm here." I didn't realize how much strength their presence gave me until that moment. For months I had carried the worry alone, hoping Dylan would come to his senses, hoping Sierra's influence would fade. But now the truth had witnesses, and that changed everything. We spread the papers across the table. Receipts, notes, old checks, bank transfers, and the forged document Dylan had so confidently presented. Laura opened her laptop and began sorting everything into folders. Dates, amounts, context. Caleb added quietly, "There's more." From his backpack he produced a worn notebook, edges softened by time. "I kept track," he said. "Every time Dylan borrowed money. I figure someday you might need it." I touched the cover, feeling the weight of years. Page after page documented small loans and forgotten promises. It wasn't resentment, it was reality. By evening, Laura laid out our options. First, we freeze anything Dylan can touch. Then we file a countersuit. We'll notify the court that his document was falsified. And we gather every piece of proof you have. I nodded. Fear mixed with resolve, but for the first time resolve was winning. We spent hours gathering what we needed. Old folders, boxes from the closet, envelopes from drawers I hadn't opened in years. Caleb climbed for the hard-to-reach shelves. Laura labeled each stack with practiced skill. The three of us moved through the house like a small united force. At one point I stepped away to make tea, needing a moment to breathe. From the doorway I watched my children working together, their focus steady and shared. A warmth filled me. This was the family I had raised. When the clock reached 10, we had built a complete record. Laura closed her laptop with a firm click. "Tomorrow," she said, "we take this to the courthouse. We take back the narrative." That night, after they went to their rooms, I sat in the living room and let the quiet settle over me. The moonlight slipped through the blinds and stretched across the floor in pale stripes. For the first time in months, I felt something returning inside me. Authority over my own life. I had spent years believing that patience and generosity could steady Dylan. But love without boundaries creates room for harm, and I had left too much room for too long. I walked to the window and watched the empty street. Life rarely changes in the explosions we fear. More often it shifts on a single choice, a single day when we finally stop letting ourselves be pushed. As I turned off the lights, I felt no dread for morning. Tomorrow held purpose, not fear. And that was enough. Before heading to bed, I paused in the hallway, brushing my fingers over the framed photographs one more time. Each image carried a reminder of who we had been, and who we still were beneath the fracture. And as I stood there in the dim quiet, I understood something simple and steady. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I chose its direction again. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and old varnish, a place where stories were stripped down to facts. Laura walked beside me with her binder tucked against her ribs, calm and steady. Caleb followed a step behind, carrying the notebook that held years of Dylan's forgotten promises. I held only my small purse, the weight of it comforting against my side. When Dylan entered the courtroom, he looked smaller than I remembered. His suit was too crisp, too new, as if he had purchased it for the performance he hoped to deliver. Sierra walked beside him, her heels clicking confidently, though her eyes darted around the room. She avoided looking at me. The judge listened carefully as Laura explained the falsified document. She presented the receipts, the transfers, the notebook of borrowed funds. Each piece of evidence settled in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Dylan tried to interrupt twice, but the judge raised a hand each time. Sierra took the stand briefly. Her voice trembled despite her polished appearance. When confronted with inconsistencies in her statement, she faltered. The careful facade she had worn for months began to crack, and with it, Dylan's confidence crumbled. The judge dismissed Dylan's claim in a measured tone, then ruled that he owed repayment for the loans documented over the years. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Dylan stared at the floor. Sierra gathered her purse without meeting his eyes. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt strangely bright. Sierra stepped away from Dylan, speaking to him in a clipped whisper. Moments later she walked off, her heels sharp against the pavement. Dylan remained standing alone near the steps, shoulders hunched. He didn't approach me. He didn't call my name. He simply watched as Laura, Caleb, and I walked to the car. The distance between us felt final, shaped not by anger but by truth laid bare. As we drove away, I caught one last glimpse of him, standing in the same suit, the future he had imagined slipping out of reach. I did not feel triumph, only a quiet ache, the kind that follows long-awaited clarity. Betrayal, once named aloud, loses some of its power but none of its sorrow. Back home, the afternoon light rested gently across the kitchen table where the forged document had once sat. The house felt different now, lighter, as if it had exhaled with me. I placed the court papers in a drawer, not out of anger but from a need to close the chapter properly. Justice had taken its course. Laura brewed tea while Caleb fixed the loose hinge on the back door, each of them moving with unspoken intention. The ordinary sounds, the kettle's low hum, the soft tapping of Caleb's tools, felt like a balm. These small, steady acts reminded me that family could still be a place of safety. Later, I stepped onto the porch and watched the sky soften into evening. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and salt. I thought of Dylan, not the man in the courtroom, but the boy who once chased fireflies in the yard. I wished him clarity. I wished him a path not built on taking. But wishing and accepting are different things. Consequences are not punishments. They are the natural shape of choices finally catching their breath. And for the first time in a long while, I felt myself breathing freely too. The morning after the hearing began quietly, with the soft hum of the refrigerator and a thin wash of light across the kitchen floor. I stood by the counter holding a warm mug of tea, the blue-striped one Mark had bought decades earlier. For the first time in months, the tea tasted exactly as it should, steady, calm, familiar. There was no tightness in my chest, no dull ache beneath my ribs, only an unfamiliar but welcome sense of balance. Laura and Caleb were still sleeping in their rooms, worn out from the long day we'd had. I walked through the house in slow circles, noticing small things I hadn't allowed myself to see properly for weeks. The neat alignment of the books on the shelf, the gentle rhythm of the ceiling fan, the framed photograph of the store on opening day. Each piece felt reclaimed, as though it had been quietly returned to me. Later, we sat together at the kitchen table with toast and fruit. Laura reviewed the court's documents one last time before closing the folder with a final, decisive motion. Caleb asked if I wanted help installing new locks or updating passwords. I smiled at both of them. I think I'm ready to handle things, I said. And I meant it. In the days that followed, I moved with purpose. I opened new accounts under secure controls. I closed the old joint emergency fund Dylan once had access to. I registered my will for safekeeping with Laura's firm, ensuring everything was clear and protected. Each task felt like placing a stone back into a foundation that had long needed reinforcement. But I didn't rebuild with walls alone. I also opened doors. I joined the community center as a volunteer instructor, teaching basic home economics to teenagers who appreciated the quiet patience I offered. Once a week I attended the local book club, where conversations flowed easily. I traveled to Charleston with a group of women from the neighborhood and found myself laughing without effort for the first time in a long while. One afternoon, while sorting old letters in the living room, I realized the house no longer felt shadowed by fear. It felt inhabited again by me, by my choices, by the life I had rebuilt piece by piece. I lit a lavender candle and let its scent fill the room. Months passed before Dylan reached out. His message was short, almost hesitant. He asked if we could meet, not to discuss money or disputes, just to talk. My heart tightened, but not with dread. Growth sometimes arrives quietly, like a tide reshaping the shore. We met on a bench near the bay. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper than they should have been. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for anything. He simply said, "Mom, I'm trying to change." His voice carried no entitlement, only fatigue and something like humility. I listened. I didn't rush to forgive, nor did I close the door. Healing, I had learned, lives somewhere between distance and possibility. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. I woke early, walked the garden path behind the house, and watched sparrows gather near the feeder Caleb had repaired. The stillness no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space reclaimed. Friends from town stopped by more often. Some brought casseroles, others simply offered company. They had heard whispers of what had happened, though none pressed for details. Community expresses itself through presence. Small gestures like a jar of peach preserves left on the porch or a note tucked beneath the door. I found myself writing again in the evenings, small reflections about the marsh, the shifting light, the comfort of a well-worn chair. These notes reminded me that life was still mine to shape, one quiet choice at a time. There were moments when the memory of Dylan's actions returned like a faint bruise touched accidentally. But the hurt no longer swallowed the day. It became a reminder of the boundaries I had learned to hold. And so with each passing week, I settled more firmly into the rhythm of a life renewed. In the quiet of early morning, I often sit by the kitchen window with my tea and watch the first light move across the yard. The house feels steady now, shaped not by fear or expectation but by the choices I finally allowed myself to make. There is a softness in this new life, a gentleness I once thought belonged only to younger years, yet it fits me now in a way that feels earned. I think of Dylan sometimes, not with bitterness, but with a distant tenderness, like remembering a path that once ran close to mine before turning sharply away. We speak occasionally, carefully, each of us stepping slowly toward a different kind of honesty. I don't know where his journey will lead, and that's no longer mine to manage. What I do know is this: I didn't destroy my family by protecting myself. I simply stopped allowing myself to be diminished in the name of love. Some truths arrive late, but they arrive exactly when we are ready to hold them. As I move through my days, teaching at the community center, tending the garden, meeting friends for quiet dinners, I feel a clarity I once feared I'd lost. Strength, I've learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it appears as a single decision spoken in a steady voice. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength.